I wanted to take a quick moment to talk about the settings that I like to use when tracking in Studio One with my quantum system. More specifically, using the native low latency monitoring path in Studio One and the way that I like to have my system set up to give me the workflow that I'm used to and that I want. Okay, so first things first, my settings. In the audio device block size of my audio setup preferences, I leave my device block size set to 32. This for me just seems to work 95% of the time. And in terms of the processing tab, I leave my dropout protection set to medium. Sometimes I will even set it to low or minimum in very edge case scenarios when I'm working with virtual instruments. But generally speaking, on a normal session, either songwriting or if I'm doing vocal tracking to a multi-track production, just leave things set exactly as you see them here. Now, the main thing that you want to do in this particular setup is, first of all, in the wrench icon options over here in the arrange window, monitoring mutes playback tape style. I always have this enabled. The reason that I have this enabled is number one, I'm used to it from Pro Tools, having an auto input monitoring style, which means that while your track is record armed, that it's kind of like a smart mode where if you're pressing play, it plays back what was on the track. But if you've stopped, actually, I'm just going to demonstrate this. I have my track now just record enabled, and I'm able to hear everything nice and clear. Now, if I press play, but if I was to press record, let's go back to the very beginning, and the track is record armed but not monitor enabled, I'm still hearing myself. So I'm now recording directly into the audio track over here. We're using our native low latency monitoring. The track is record armed, but it's not monitor enabled. And this is the main thing over here. Monitoring mutes playback tape style is enabled. This gives me the workflow that I want where I can record an artist, immediately put them into record mode. If I stop the playback or I stop the transport, they can immediately hear themselves again, and they don't have to worry about setting up another track or something like that. The only byproduct of this mode, which is the exact same if you're using, for example, auto input monitoring in Pro Tools, what I was used to using, or at least how it was up until I last used Pro Tools regularly, in that if I wanted to play something back, I could play something back and then I could drop into a punch, and then I would hear myself when I drop into the punch, I would hear my live mic. So I'm going to do that right now, just showcase that. I'm still hearing myself. So I'm now recording directly into the audio track over here. And now I've just done a punch in, and this would be the equivalent of me punching in a different section, and then I can punch out at any given point. So maybe after this section here, I'm going to do a punch out. This gives me the workflow that I want so that is the basic setup that I use for 99% of my sessions. My monitoring mutes playback tape style is enabled. My device block size is set to 32 samples. My processing is set to medium. And this gives me a really awesome round trip latency. And then the one thing you have to make sure you do over here is enabling low latency monitoring, and then it just works. Now, one important note about using this style of workflow, where you're using this Green Z native low latency monitoring workflow. If I'm monitoring just the main outs, that's perfectly fine. But what happens if I'm sending Q mixes to different people? Okay, well, let's take a look at that really quickly. I'm going to just switch my monitoring for a second over here. Now, if I'm working with Q mixes, in that case, I open up my audio IO setup, and I would just basically designate what Q mix I'm going to be using. So I have a Q mix set up over here over SPDIF. Let's say I enable QA, which means that I'm sending out a different mix to somebody, and they're going to be monitoring with that Q mix. I'm going to click apply, and then I'm going to click OK. And now, if I open up my Outputs tab, notice over here in QA, we have the option to enable low latency monitoring as well. So this is really important when you're using this style of workflow. On the main outs, it's pretty simple because it's clearly visible. But if the person monitoring through QA, let's say I was monitoring this exact path, I'm going to just close my outputs. Just going to pull up my sends over here and pull up my QMix. Now, notice over here, we have this icon. I'm just going to click the outputs, and now I'm going to enable QA. I've enabled low latency monitoring for QA. Now, if I close this Outputs tab over here, you'll see that this QMix now has a Z on it. This is indicating that this is in the low latency monitoring path. Now, another thing to take into account when you use this workflow for the outputs is that the click that's going out to this queue is discrete. It's completely independent. So this is functioning in parallel with my click that I'm monitoring here. I can set the click level and the click active or deactive state directly from this output. Now, once again, I'm just going to deactivate this QMix and click this Outputs tab. Notice that QA no longer has this Z on. So there's some type of visual indication that's kind of showing you that you need to do something in order to get that low latency monitoring path for the queue. And then of course, it's completely visible. Once you get used to kind of seeing this Z, if I don't see that Z, I know, oh, I forgot to enable low latency monitoring for that specific output. But this is how I work. And for anybody who's worked with Pro Tools in the past, I can't speak for other DAWs because I know some of them have different modes, but let me just say, for anybody who's worked with an auto input monitoring style workflow in Pro Tools or other DAWs, this is exactly how it works when you're using the green Z mode or the native low latency monitoring mode with Studio One with interfaces that have a significantly low round trip latency, such as the Quantum like I'm using in this particular video. Anyways, that's all the time I have available for today. I hope that you enjoyed this content. If you did, please consider hitting that like and subscribe button. Any questions or comments, leave them down below. I will do my absolute best to get back to you. And as always, we will catch you in the next video. Cheers.